Good morning and welcome to Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. This is another day where we are going to have a conversation that debunks myths or maybe supports the information behind myths. We don't know. One of the purposes of starting a new series of conversations was to get out of the traditional gap thinking of the way that I've been talking about education for a long time, and see if I could challenge myself to have some more important conversations that break new ground or at least find new understanding. And today I just want to take a break from the several conversations we've had recently about people who have overcome great odds to transcend what their early beginnings were, their humble beginnings, and to so-called beat the system and have a different discussion. Because when we talk about education in the United States, most of the time we are really firm in our beliefs and understandings and certain about those beliefs and understandings, but sometimes they're built on really shaky ground. We we say things, we trade just slogans. It's just things we've been taught to say. And today we're going to talk about one of those. And you have heard it, I have heard it, everybody has heard it. American public schools are built on a factory model. Of course they are. They even have things embedded in them from an agrarian calendar. It's a change on the factory model play. That the reason we have summers off is so that kids could come and get the imaginary harvest that comes in the summer. That doesn't really make sense, right? So today I have Jennifer Binnis from Twitter, who is a fact checker, a historian. She is a historiosity person. She loves to test the validity of these things that we say and challenge them online. Jen and I have gone back and forth about different issues, many various issues, but I do respect the fact that you want to get things right in life. So that's when you bring in someone like Jennifer. So Jennifer, good morning. Thank you for joining.
Hey, good morning.
So listen, this thing about the factory model school is one of those things that's burned and etched into the minds of us now. It's kind of like it's a truism. It's taken for granted.
Mhm.
Presidents have said it. Secretaries of Education have said it. I did a little prep and knowing that we were going to talk about this today, and it's really all over the place, and it goes back real far. I can't find a point of origin for it. I tried real hard to find the first person who maybe said it. And there were a couple of guesses in what I read, but it does go back really far.
Mhm.
So what's wrong with this claim that public schools are based on a factory model?
Sure. So first, the first wrongness often comes down to what it is the speaker is attempting to accomplish. And 9 times out of 10, when someone says schools are based on factories, it's because they want to change something. They don't like something about what they think school is doing, and they want to advocate for change. So what it is, it's a way of positioning the speaker as someone who has solutions. So as a rhetorical device, the first problem is it's often trying to solve a problem that doesn't really exist. And if we kind of try to unpack the factory model, my understanding of the origins of the phrase factory model schools was in the 1970s when it really started to be used as a rhetorical device. The challenge is that there were people who talked about schools like factories in the 1800s, early 1900s. But what we forget as modern readers is the connotation of factory in 2021 is very different than it was in 1820 or 1920. So when someone says, well, look at this book, this particular person said schools, are like factories. Well, yes, they were making an analogy. And when they thought of schools, when they thought of factories, it had a very different sort of connotation. Probably the most thoughtful breakdown of where the analogy falls apart is Audrey Waters' piece, The Invented History of the Factory Model. And what she does is break down factories back then, when people use the phrase, do not look like factories of today. So what we think of, assembly lines, bells, shifts, that wasn't what factories were like when people use the analogy. Instead, when people talked about schools like factories, it really was about an analogy, and it was about efficiency. Because as public schools were spreading across the land and really becoming something most kids did across the country, The goal was to figure out how to do this as effectively and as efficiently as possible, because society was interested in efficiency. It wasn't just school. If you are familiar with the book Cheaper by the Dozen, the authors of that particular book were interested in efficiency parenting. And so they put their kids on shifts. They had an assembly line for making sandwiches. They did efficient things in parenting because society was interested in efficiency. So the biggest problem is people take quotes from an earlier era and apply it to the modern era. Yes, that's the fantastic piece. And the other challenge with the phrase is that what it is the speaker is attempting to accomplish. And she's pulled together a bunch of quotes there.
So this piece, I read it over and over again to find, I know you had put it up before and you had really thought that it creates, like, I think, some doubt about the idea of the model, the factory model school as based in history, but I couldn't see where she was really dislocating it from the historical basis as much as just taking issue with minor points. Like, like the factory looked different than it does now, kind of like what you just said, but it was still part of the program to make schools very much like factories.
It wasn't. And I appreciate that distinction about needing to separate from history. So we can break off schools have nothing to do with factories for a couple different reasons. First and foremost is that when we look at the history of education in America, the origins of public education started long before the Industrial Revolution came to America. So this idea of having schools across the plains, one-room schoolhouses, that system was set up long before the idea of factories even made it to the shore. Mm-hmm. So the foundation for public education was in place long before factories. So if anyone tries to say, well, schools are based on factories, well, no, schools were based on schools. And when schools became larger and more common because there were more bodies in schools, people who were crafting the modern school looked to different places to get ideas on how to run schools efficiently. And one of the places they looked was to business. And that's how we get some parallel structures, but that's about bureaucracy. That's about efficiency. That's not about schools as factories. And probably the most common myth, people will say, well, the bells. I want to reiterate that point that if someone says schools are based on factories, our first obligation as a listener is to consider what that message that person is giving. What is the point of comparing schools to factories? What are they seeking to accomplish? And so one of the kind of classic examples people will put out there is bells. How we have 42-minute periods and we have bells to train kids to work on a factory floor. The first way we know that's historically inaccurate is because the subject that kids were studying when the 42-minute period was created was Greek and Latin. That was the most advocated course in public schools, Greek and Latin and literature and mathematics and science. Nothing that prepares you to work on a factory floor. And the idea that bells are about training children to work in factories is strictly ahistorical. Again, bells were used throughout history as a way to communicate to large groups of people. It has nothing to do with factories. So this idea, and one of the authors who's very fond of using that particular analogy is a man whose last name is Gatto, who recently passed away. And what he did is what it's very easy for us to do in the modern era is to look at a text and extrapolate information from it based on a modern lens. And what he learned about was a particular school outside of Detroit that used bells to move children through a large campus. And what kids did is they were broken into 3 different groups. There was like platoon A, platoon B, and platoon C. And platoon A was in the academic classroom with teachers, doing reading and writing and history and all that great stuff. Platoon B was doing art and music and cooking and gardening. Platoon C was playing on the playground. They were playing inside. They were having a good time. They were just playing. A recess, basically. And then the bells would ring and they would shift. So what Gatto did is took this story about how people in the town would hear the ringing of the bells at the school, and he determined that that was training kids for factory working. And basically what it was saying to kids who were working in a garden, hey, it's time to come in and get cleaned up to head to recess or to head to something else. So when we see these kernels in the modern writing, oh, schools are based on factories, bells are training kids for factories, it's usually because someone saw a kernel of something in historical text and extrapolated it out of context.
So I want to challenge that just a little bit because you mentioned John Taylor Gatto. For people who don't know, John Taylor Gatto has a book called Dumbing Down, and he also has the book where he really does more of what you're saying, Jen, is weapons of mass instruction.
Yeah, and it needs to be said explicitly and clearly, the man was racist and sexist. He should not be taken seriously by anybody. And any man who claims to write a history but calls enslaved people employees, who talks about Thomas Jefferson's employees, that is not a man who can be trusted with any history, with anything related to education. So I will now step off my soapbox about that particular author.
Well, I'm going to say, like, if we want to remove everybody who is sexist and racist from the discussion, we're going to have a very short discussion about public education, because everybody from Dewey to Horace Mann and others had those exact same claims. So
all the names that you listed, you know, the dudes. We could have a great history with Anna Julia Cooper. We could have a great history with Prudence Crandall. There is an entire gorgeous history we could have, but that's another conversation.
Well, no, actually, it's part of this discussion because I think it's important to have you on with this perspective because you can help with this. So one of the claims that I hear in what you're saying, or I don't know if it's a claim, just one of the things that I'm hearing you say about the use of factory model as a archetype of discussion, a way that we talk about public schools. You have to take into account the person's motivation for why they're saying it or where it's coming from. Okay, so maybe I accept that, maybe I don't, because I don't feel like I feel like it's really clear in some cases someone's trying to push you an ed tech product, for instance. So they'll say this, right? So we need innovation so you can have my ed tech product. So let's get away from the factory model. For others, they're just it's not so clear for me that that's why they're doing it. And there is more serious history for us to get into that is aside from why someone's trying to sell it. But if we go to someone like Hayek, his book, One Best System, right? If you think about that book, he is talking about the conversion of public schools from the early models into these hyper efficient, very bureaucratized, industrialized, unionized, urbanized environments that Americans had not been used to prior to a group of private men, a group of private people deciding that they were going to change the primitive state of public education and make it world class in the way that they knew how to make it world class. Many of those people were captains of industry. So you have the Rockefeller people and others gathering together. And when you look at what they were envisioning for public education, much of it was about a dumb citizenry. They were, in fact, saying very clear things like, we don't want artists and these free thinking people or blah, blah, blah. We want to prepare people for a modern society. And by modern, they meant them on top and, you know, the children of immigrants and others to become good little citizens. But it wasn't the teachers that were doing that. It wasn't the people who work in schools every day that was doing that. It was captains of industry privately behind closed doors, putting lots of money into making public education become in their own image. And part of that was the factory model.
Well, and yet they failed. So there, again, when we talk about the factory model, we have to be very specific about what we're talking about. What is it we mean when we say factory model? So speakers use it very differently. And again, speakers use it to signal that they have an answer that no one in the past has ever had before. For example, I'm thinking of Todd Rose, who wrote a really good book called The End of Average, except he has an entire chapter where he sets up some bad history. He quotes Gatto, he quotes a bunch of really not trustworthy history in order to say, you should do what I recommend as Todd Rose, a man in, you know, the 2010s, because I have the answer no one else has ever thought of before. So a lot of times people will say the factory model because they want to position themselves as being a unique prophet amongst the teaching world. And part of that we have to wrestle with is what they are saying is that I am, and it's almost always a white man. So when you talk about the captains of industry, those are all wealthy white men we're talking about here who thought they had the answer. But the idea of unionizing schools, that came out of the hard work of the women teachers who said, we are sick and tired of getting paid 1/3 as much as our male colleagues are. We are sick and tired of being told that we will get fired if we show up pregnant. But if we tell our male principal, we're going to Europe for 9 months, ooh, we'll be back next school year, just going to go to the continent, no big deal, we can keep our job because we've protected womanhood by not showing up pregnant and unmarried, whatever the case may be. So what we have are dueling histories. And so, yes, there was a theoretical idea that schools, they would talk about what they wanted in schools. But again, I'm thinking of the documentary Most Likely to Succeed, which talked about the captains of industry you talked about, but yet they ascribed to them power that they simply didn't have. American public education is locally controlled. In order to control things on a systemic level, you have to be able to control millions of individual levers and powers of control. And that's very, very hard to do. So one of the other things that Tyvek does is he talks about the idea of grammar of schooling. And grammar of schooling is one thing that can help us think about how some things are the same across the country. So, for example, in American schools, we use a gender identifier and a person's last name to talk about adults. That is a distinctly American thing. It happens in other countries, but it is an American phenomenon that in American schools, we use a gender modifier and a person's last name. It is an American thing to have apples, apple motifs, to have bulletin boards, to have aesthetics that associate a school with a school. None of that came from captains of industry. That came out of the people who ran school, a lot of which was shaped by Protestantism. In American schools, boys and girls learn side by side, which is a function and a consequence of Protestantism, that families sit together and they aren't separated by gender. So one of my frustrations with the factory model school is it gives so much power to white male industrialists who had no actual control. The only exception to that is Andrew Carnegie, who created a retirement system for colleges that said, I will only fund your retirement if you accept certain kinds of students. And so we created the Carnegie unit, where kids have to have a period of math, a period of history, a period of English, and created kind of the modern high school schedule. But that's not about factories. That's not about efficiency. That's not about factories. It's about saying we want kids to get a broad liberal arts education. And the best way to do that is to create units of instruction. And yes, Carnegie did play an outsized role in the creation of that because of his role in how he shaped college retirement systems. But at the same time, he created that system because high schools were already heading in that direction. So the rise of the period was around in the 1870s, 1860s. New York City high schools were already doing that stuff long before Carnegie created a system because it worked. It made sense. If you want to expose kids to literature and to mathematics and to science and to history and to physical education and art and to music, you have to break it up into smaller chunks so kids can do all of those things.
Even that, what you're saying right now, though, I will challenge that, even what you just said, as a very Western concept. Very Western, very white, very industrial. Break things up into units, break them up into, compartmentalize them. The early education really did. The days weren't so structured in that way. You might talk about the river today. You might talk about the plains and different Montessori. The Montessori method, I think, does a lot of thinking around how to break those things down, to go backwards on those things, right? Not forward on them. That is a very Western white way of seeing the world that much of the world didn't participate in. thinking that
One of the
way.
things I think we can do, though, is to stop talking about men like John Dewey and start talking about Maria Montessori. Replace as much as we can names like Dewey from
Okay,
our
but wait,
conversation.
just stop there for a second, though. We would do that if the system had listened to Maria and had made the system in her making. So here's a challenge that I'll give to you about the 1970s. This came up in a discussion I had yesterday. There was an explosion of new ideas about how to do school in the 1970s. And it was all based on the fact that the traditional white Western system of everything was really inhumane and demeaning to kids. And that's when you saw an explosion of interest in things like Montessori, free
Mhm.
schools, open schools, schools without walls, schools on roller
Lots
skates. I
of
always make fun of it.
experimentation.
Yeah, lots of experimentation. And it was often led by instructors or by educators who themselves were making the critique of the system that they had been in as being one that was over overly concerned about efficiency
Sure.
and hour by hour what you learn and that sort of thing.
Hmm. And that's very much the pull of whiteness. That is the gravitational force that is whiteness, where those systems did require discomfort amongst white parents. They had to be uncomfortable that school didn't look the way they thought it should look. And so the system, and I'm a fan of using the word system because it happens, it's a way to describe the way things interact. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to describe something as a system. So, for example, in the Sung Dynasty in China, when they were teaching the five arts, there was a system for giving standardized tests to
Hmm.
thousands of men across the country, across China at the same time. It was way before factories, it was way before modern public schooling, but this idea of breaking things down into smaller parts, which they did with the five arts, which they did with helping the test takers memorize the content they needed to memorize, isn't inherently a bad thing. When we look at early study of the Quran and in Arabic nations or in Muslim nations, they would break down the study of the Quran into smaller parts. And scholars would sit with their students and teach them smaller and smaller, smaller parts that into bigger parts. Aristotle broke things down into smaller parts to teach to his learners. So that idea isn't inherently bad. It's we recognize when we bring together large groups of young people and we want to share knowledge, we need structures to share that knowledge. Where whiteness and Americana comes in is grades and class rankings and GPAs and college admission and the competition and the look of school as a place where you get rules on the first day of school. So this idea of what happened in the 70s, it required that white parents be discomforted. And the system shifted back. Some places, those structures that you described remain. There are still, New York State still has 7 one-room schoolhouses that have
Hmm.
been one-room schoolhouses since the very beginning, where they have 5-year-olds in the same physical space as 17-year-olds. And so when we talk about American public education, very often we're talking in very, very gross generalizations because they have to be big because we're talking about, I don't mean to gross in the sense of large as opposed to, unappealing, because we're talking about a system with 50 different histories or 56 different histories, 57 if you count Department of Defense schools. So when we talk about factory model schools, we're doing such an incredible disservice to the women who were in the classroom, to the Black women who fought for systemic, education in the American South as a way to bring Black women into the construct of womanhood as it existed at the time. So factory model schools takes this gorgeous, amazing, complicated history and says, oh no, schools are like factories. And every time I'm like, that's so disrespectful.
I don't
It
think it does that though. I just want to be clear here. Like I'm with you. I'm shaking my head yes to a lot of what you say, and then at the same time, I'm thinking you're doing what you're accusing others of doing, which is you're oversimplifying their argument, their
Yeah,
factory model argument, and I
yeah,
think you're your feminist orientation on the discussion is one that's of interest to me. At the same time, I think you're making light of what the white women did within the system. Like when you say that unions came out of white women just not wanting to have to explain being pregnant, that's such an oversimplification.
Sure.
I'm thinking of books like Uncivil Rights, that talks about the history of teacher unionism in the United States. Much of what they were fighting for was for white supremacy. So much of the early attempts at unionization were for things like not being forced the indignation of having to be transferred to a Negro school, for instance. And we also have to talk about the fact there was a battle within the history of white women teacher unionism. There was a battle between those that were on the more radical edge and those that wanted a professionalized, bureaucratized,
Sure.
more in line with the system. And the one who lost in that battle are the ones that were more on the communist, radical,
Yeah.
pre-UFT side of the fence, where they were pushing for things like racial justice and integration and social justice broadly. They lost in the
Yeah.
teacher unionism battle. So when I hear you like say a lot about the maleness and it's a feminist critique of the history and the system that I will buy. I will rock with you on that. The part where you get to the feminist part, or the white women being somehow not participants in the patriarchy or the racism or the white
And yes,
supremacy of the
yeah,
time, like.
yeah.
But I do want to back up all the way back up just for a second and ask you if you have problems with the real way that Gatto and others lay out the argument. The
Yes.
way that they lay out the argument is this. They say that there was a time when when education in general in the United States was in a primitive state. And during that time, it was largely entrepreneurial, and it was not delivered by a large state apparatus. It was on a place-by-place basis. There came things like the deluder, the satanic deluder, right, or whatnot, which was a push to start forcing localities to educate their children so that they don't become victims to the devil. Yeah. So they don't start communing with the devil type of thing. And from that grew greater and greater systematization of education. What they will say is at one point, the fathers, and this is where I know your feminism lens will come in, the fathers of public education took a trip to Prussia and were so enamored with what they saw about how organized it was that PhDs, people with PhDs, which was rare, very rare at the time, from Canada and the United States and lots of the Western world went to Prussia and studied and brought it home. And that's where you got some of your first laws that were calling for statewide, state-funded public education. And when they did that, there was lots of literature that the public was not aware of. And I could get the names of the people, I don't have them before me, but many of those people that the Prussian model was based on were ignoring the fact that the Prussian model of education was based on the fact that they had some bruising losses, military losses, and they were attempting to retrain their men to not think so much, right? Not think so much, right? That's their real argument.
No, I have to, that's
That's the real argument. That's the real argument.
Ahistorical. So I've got to step in and say, yes, all of that is completely ahistorical. And even if we do straight dates, we can document how that is ahistorical. First, New York State had a statewide system of education in 1787, long before anybody went to Prussia. So New York State in 1787 was saying, hey, we would benefit from having a system that looks at education across the entire state, long before Prussia. And this idea that America was just sitting around waiting to figure out how to do public education. Oh, look, Prussia. Ooh. It doesn't reflect the reality. One of my favorite reports from someone who went to Prussia was from a New York schoolman. And he went to Prussia. He wrote his report, came back, said, yeah, that's great. That's never going to work in New York State. And one of the reasons was about taxes. The Prussian system just didn't fit with the New York State system. Second kind of piece we know that's ridiculous is because one of the things that Horace Mann came back from Prussia was he was very excited in teacher training. New York State was doing teacher training long before Horace Mann went to Prussia. So this idea that somehow Prussia had cracked an egg or, figured out this big mystery, how do we do public education? They were figuring it out at the same time American schools were teaching Greek and Latin and physics and natural philosophy and mathematics. So American states in different ways had education long before anybody went to Prussia. So anytime anyone says
So to be clear, though, that's not one of the claims. One of the
well,
claims
the claim
isn't
is
that.
they found something in Prussia that we didn't have here, which isn't true.
Okay, well, let's break it down to see what is true. Are you saying that it's not true that that some of the primary early adopters of what we have, like the Massachusetts model of public education, are we agreeing that they went to Prussia?
Oh yes, people went to Prussia because
Okay,
that was
not
the
just
thing that
people, but some of the primary founding so-called fathers of public education went to Prussia, not just from the United States, but also from Russia and elsewhere in the white world.
sure. At the same time, people also came to the United States to see how United States did things. So
Yeah,
this
that's not the claim
idea,
that I'm making, though. I'm not
but
making
yes,
it.
but I'm,
I'm
I'm
not.
saying that
I'm not
that claim
making.
unto itself isn't anything spectacular. Yes, yes, people who
I'm not
support
making a
education
claim that the
went to
United
Prussia.
States didn't have something going on already, because that's not even part of the argument. That the United States, there's no part of this argument that's saying the United States wasn't already doing some things in patchworks in different parts of the colonies or different parts of the states or whatnot. That's not really it. It's that some of the leading men who would become the architects of much of what we consider to be public education today took a trip, and on that trip, so we're agreeing that they took the trip, that they
Yes.
went to Russia, and not just from the United States, but also from Canada and from some other places, and that they were pivotal people. It wasn't marginal people that were doing this. These were people
Some
that
marginal people went as well.
yeah, some marginal people, but I mean, we're not concerned with them really. The history doesn't really, yeah, we're not really concerned with them just in that they didn't come back and start establishing things
Yeah,
based
see,
upon what they
I,
learned.
Chris, I can't sit with those two words, start establishing, because nothing happened after people went to Prussia that wasn't already happening. So, in other words, nobody went to Prussia, came back with Eureka, here's what we're going to do now. People went to Prussia, said, this is interesting, this is interesting, oh, this will never work. Ooh, let me think about how this might work over here, and applied it. Pedagogy didn't change as a result of a trip to Prussia because there wasn't a mechanism for changing American pedagogy. So, yes, Prussia may have institutionalized a particular system for their needs, retraining soldiers, but that simply didn't work here. We were already doing the Pledge of Allegiance around that time, or an early approximation of the Pledge of Allegiance. Kids were reading, early primers with Americana myths about, George Washington and Columbus, and they were doing math, and they were outside playing. They were doing school things already before anyone went to Prussia. So the idea that Prussia played any role in the evolution of American education gives an outsized authority to the men who went to Prussia, because they didn't come back and do anything remarkable because they didn't have access to the mechanisms that would lead to systemic change.
So when we get the first kind of like public education law, like from Massachusetts, you're saying that didn't come out of anything that anybody got from Prussia.
I mean, it's possible that the early schools in Massachusetts and New York kind of developed at the same time. I'm telling you that there's a New Yorker went to Prussia, came back and said, that's not going to work in New York State. That he said, yeah, that system's not going to work for us. We're going to keep doing what we're doing here. So I'm not going to say that men weren't informed by what they saw in Prussia, because school men were constantly taking ideas from each other and sharing them. But what I'm saying is that Prussia is given an outsized role in American education. In the history that modern people tell, they point to Prussia as if Prussia was some sort of magic place in terms of education, when it wasn't. I mean, the things that Horace Mann brought back were related to bureaucracy, related to making sure every teacher had a clock, making sure every teacher had a rug inside her door, making sure every teacher had access to textbooks. So the idea that he brought back was kind of things people were already thinking about, which speaks to my frustration with the factory model as a phrase, because I appreciate what you were saying before about my feminist lens. I can hold in my mind the fact that American teachers were unionized to benefit the women. At the same time, the actions of white women made life harder for Black children. I can hold those two truths in my mind
Yeah,
at the same time. Factory model, though, blasts all of that away. It
it does
eliminates.
not though.
It does.
This
It
is
does.
where I think there's overreach in your argument about this. If I'm being honest, I don't think. First of all, I don't think calling it a factory model is at all a blast on the women, for instance, or making it about the men. So I don't see it with the feminist lens.
I
I
would
see
invite
it.
you to. I understand you don't. I would invite you to.
Well, I mean, I'm sure you would, but I mean, I would invite you to see the white supremacy lens on most things or whatnot.
Okay, no problem.
But if we were to take both of those lenses off and just say, can we agree on Wednesday is Wednesday and Thursday is Thursday and Friday is Friday? We have to agree about some things about in this discussion, like, did Horace Mann go to Prussia to look at the Prussian system? Is that a yes or no, or is it, or should we say, well, but he's a man, so we shouldn't trust the fact
Hey,
that he took a
that's
trip,
a little
right?
bit snarky there. What I'm
Right?
going
No,
to
I
say
am being
is,
snarky
sure,
about it,
but
but I just
why
want
do
to
you
like,
care? Why do we care that Horace Mann went to Prussia?
um, because we're unraveling a story, and that would be say like, why do we care about that Aristotle existed or what he did or whatever?
Not
Because
necessarily.
these things have import to our understanding of the whole story.
Okay,
So
so
we
if
want
that's
to.
the case, then when Horace Mann came back from Prussia, he wrote a series of reports. There is nothing in Horace Mann's reports from Prussia about factories. There is nothing about automatizing children. There is nothing about training soldiers. So even if Horace Mann did go to Prussia,
I mean, there's nothing about slavery really in a lot of American documents, but it was part of what they were attempting to do. I mean, American documents are full of things where they're saying they're setting up a system, and it may not necessarily be telling you about the slavery that's going to come out of that system, for
so
instance.
if we read between the
So,
lines that Horace Mann did want to do those things, Horace Mann had control over only one state. So even if we say that, yes, Horace Mann did, he
again, I
didn't.
think that's making too little of it. Horace Mann went in. Let's look at this. Okay, so American educators were fascinated with German. I'm just reading a little text on their argument, which is American educators were fascinated by German educational trends. In
What's
1818,
the source
John,
of this? What are you looking at?
I could send you a link here. Because I just want to make sure you always want to make sure that you're giving the opposing side's argument fair treatment, right? What they are actually saying versus what they're not saying. And I find it hard to disagree with some of this. I'm going to put it
Okay.
in,
So
paste it into the comments there. So just this is just a quote from it saying, a quote that's germane to what we're saying right now. Emulation of the Prussian education system in the United States is the headline of just one little
oh, I
part
didn't
of it.
even realize there was a section over here. Hey, Corey, we should chat sometime.
You see Corey DeAngelis in there.
Yeah, and I don't even know what he's going on about. Is this okay? This is a
Yeah, there's
Wikipedia.
comments in there. Yeah, so people are commenting as we're talking.
Yeah,
So
having
listen
paid
what this
attention.
says. American educators were fascinated by German educational trends in
Wait, wait,
1818.
I can't listen
Yeah,
to that because I'm not sure where we're looking. Okay, my understanding is we're looking at a page on GermanAmericanPioneers.org.
yeah, yeah.
So, okay, I'm not a American educators are fascinated by German educational trends is a statement by somebody who's written a webpage. There's nothing. There's no history there. There's no citations. There's no sources. That's some person's opinion. So to say that American educators they weren't. There were a group of white dudes who were interested in Prussia,
I
but
mean, if
who
you don't,
cares?
well,
Who
okay. I mean,
cares?
and then I guess that ends all arguments, right? So then we can have no conversations about American history because we can say, well,
No,
that was white dudes who thought about that. So
right.
like let's not talk about the Constitution because that was what white
And,
dudes thought at the
but I
time,
get it.
right?
But no, those are white dudes who made decisions that impacted me in 2021. What Horace Mann thought as a result of a trip to Prussia, didn't impact policy in a way across American education that a lot of people try to act like it does.
Well, let me get through this part right here, right?
So
Okay,
do
just
website, I mean,
well,
yeah,
I mean, like we can attack the source or we can attack the message. Like so
we can
let's do
attack
one or
both
the
in
other.
this
So,
case.
yeah, but let's at least like
Oh, this is
hear what the
killing
message
me,
is.
Chris.
So,
This is killing me. Horace Mann was largely responsible for the introduction of compulsory. That makes no sense. That is so terribly ahistorical. Oh, this is terrible. Because compulsory public education, Prussian style, is very, very, there's no, oh my goodness,
okay,
I'm
so
not
what this is
sure.
basically saying for people watching and listening, what this is basically saying is that there was interest in the German system of public education, and people from across the world came in 1818 and around those times and brought back portions of it that they appreciated back to their states. There was like the report on the state of public education in Prussia. That was like one report that was done. Foundational people like Calvin Stowe, Henry Bernard, Horace Mann, George Bancroft, and Joseph Cogwell, among others, were ones who studied this, made a trip. Mann made a trip to Germany in 1843 to investigate how the educational processes worked. Upon his return to the United States, he lobbied heavily to have the Prussian model adopted. He was largely responsible for the introduction of compulsory public education, Prussian style, in the United States. Much of that, when they say they attribute those things to him, it's for the early laws that weren't on the
Which
books.
doesn't make sense.
Well, the
Which
laws that he pushed for in the state of in Massachusetts that became part of
and
Massachusetts
again,
educational history, like as the foundational
those laws
system.
already existed in other states before Mann went to Prussia. In other words, I don't understand. I truly do not understand the obsession with Prussia. And I saw someone mention it in the comments. We can talking about the Rosenwald schools is so much more about American education history than talking about what one man did on a trip to Prussia. And one of my
Saying
frustrations,
like one man did, you're not going to get through education school without studying Horace Mann, the foundational things that he is responsible for that came after him that other states adopted and spread widely. There, you're just it's almost like saying, it's why talk about Thomas Jefferson
and
in
yet it's not
America's
Chris. And I
founding
appreciate what you're saying.
he's so marginal as
And
one
yet,
guy,
and
and
yet,
he's not.
Thomas Jefferson wrote a founding document of this country. Thomas Jefferson had weight as one of the founders of this nation. Horace Mann was one man in one state who was given an outsized role because we like to think of education as something that came out of white dudes' brains. It didn't. It emerged from a variety of sources in a variety of times. And probably if I controlled education and instead of people learning about Horace Mann, I would want people to read books like this. I would want people to learn about Prudence Crandall, because one of the challenges of the factory model myth, of this whole idea of Prussia, is we blow past so much history. We lose sight of all the advocacy that happened amongst Black women in the antebellum America around creating systems of education for young Black girls in order to help defeat white supremacy. When we focus on Mann and the factory model, we lose sight of all of that history. So you said I was doing
I
the thing
think
I do.
what you're saying right now is where I think white feminism and the lens that I have on white supremacy contrast with each other. That's where they clash,
Okay.
is because I agree with you when you say we can learn so much by focusing on these other people like I do. Lucy Craft Delaney, one of the first people to start one of the first Black kindergartens in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at her life, it's a remarkable life
And
of
do you think
what
she
she did.
cared
She was
what
able
Horace Mann
to.
thought? Do you honestly think she cared about Horace Mann?
I think I think what she cared about and what many of the Black educators, if you look at Vanessa Siddle Walker's work and you look
Mm-hmm.
at all the work that was done with the Rosenwald schools and others, that is a rich story to tell. They were living within a white supremacist context
Sure.
of which Horace Mann is not a marginal figure. They were living within a white supremacist context of which the men of industry, like the Rockefellers and others were not marginal figures in determining how public education was done. In fact, some of those people were funding some of the schools that they were doing, and in some cases, they were having an influence on what was taught in the schools that they were helping them fund, and sometimes not for the betterment of Black people, but for the continued subservience of Black people, for instance. So a white feminist lens on this is useful to a point, I guess. But what I am saying back to you is, I can't just say these some white dudes who had no real power and were marginal in the story, because I don't think that that actually does justice to the white supremacy story.
Sure.
They did have power and influence. They did actually break things down in public education to very efficient units of things with a white Western way of looking at the world that China didn't have, that Yugoslavia didn't have at the time, that others didn't have. And they did at some point, this is where the feminist part is really hard to understand and follow you with a little bit, in that they were actually, there was a time in which males ran the ship, and then they more and more increasingly saw themselves less as teachers and more as the people who would dominate and run the thing and order it, do the ordering. And those same men were interacting with the men of industry and labor in other parts of the world too, in other parts of the country. And there's no way for me to look at some of like the General Education Board that was set up by the captains of industry and say that didn't have much power or influence over the way that schools operated or the way that high schools were developed, for instance. It's we will agree on a lot of things, but that those are marginal characters in the world, to me, doesn't do justice to the white supremacy story.
Yeah. And I would offer, we can talk about the white supremacy story without talking about Horace Mann. In other words, we can talk about the white supremacy that happened at the same time of the old Alluder-Satan law. In other words, at the same time that the people in Massachusetts were ordering towns to build schools, in Virginia, they were saying, if you come across an unattended Indigenous child and you kidnap them and you re-educate them into Christian education, that's you being a good Christian. So we can talk about white supremacy.
I mean, what did they call that? Kill the Indian, save the man?
Yeah. And so, in other words, when we talk about the men going to Prussia, those white men, the phrase factory model schools narrows history to a single narrative. That's why I disagree with the use of the factory model, because instead of talking about white supremacy, we're talking about the factory model. And the factory model is misleading, because it wasn't about organizing schools like factories. It wasn't about preparing kids to work in factories. It's become this shorthand that just a speaker tends to use to say, I know something no one else knows.
See, I don't like, I feel like that's such a dismissive point of what factory model schooling
is
actually saying.
So. Because the people who started using the phrase, though, Chris, were intending to dismiss Black advocates. They were working to dismiss anyone who's advocating for change.
It's just not true. Like, Black people themselves were making that argument against public schooling in the 60s and the 70s.
I have never come across a Black historian who's used the phrase factory model schools. The only people I've ever seen use the phrase factory model schools have been white. That doesn't mean it wasn't used.
Yeah.
And they definitely made arguments about white supremacy. They made arguments about the structure, about grades, about evaluation, about all of that stuff, but they didn't use the phrase factory model. That is a modern white.
When I was looking it up for this conversation, that was used broadly. And there's a uptick of it being used in the 60s and the 70s as you see an explosion of freedom schools, and you see an explosion of people wanting to bust out of the schools that are run like kids are a product, like they're going. So there is this is the hard part that I'm having with your argument is just that I think the feminist lens on that you are putting on it is causing you to give short shift to the idea that there are people making the same argument who where it isn't about patriarchy, it is about the lack of critical thinking that takes place when you process children like they're a commodity. When you say things like they Americanized.
Yes,
public
let's
schools,
talk about that.
public schools have Americanized kids
Yes,
for years and blah blah blah, and we put all
let's
these
talk
like
about that.
these unwashed immigrants through their doors, and they all came out
Absolutely.
shiny Americans the other
Bright,
end.
shiny Americans.
What you're
Let's
saying
use
is
that.
basically like this is a processing center of sorts, and here's my problem that I have with it. Even if I will rock with you and agree with you on the feminist like critique of that argument or who's saying it, first of all, I don't think it's just white dudes saying it and I'm saying it. I'm saying it because I actually was a student who didn't appreciate bells and whistles and everything being standardized and
Sure.
the dehumanizing, depersonalizing aspects
Yes. Let's talk about
of the
that.
major schools. And here's one last thing I'll add. With the massive consolidation of schools getting the bigger and bigger to where you got Columbine style schools, there is research that tells you that white kids did better in the Columbine type schools than kids of color did. That smaller schools actually worked
Sure.
better for kids in urban environments. But we didn't do smaller. We did what worked for the larger group of people. And we did it with business like proficiency on things like, well, an economy of scale. Well, economy of scale doesn't sound like an educative principle. That sounds like a business principle to
Sure.
me. Economy of scale. That sounds familiar. Isn't that what you do when you want to build a Model T, right?
So my claim is I disagree with the use of the factory model because I think it narrows history to a single narrative. My claim is to advocate, instead of using factory models, let's talk about the dehumanization in schools. Let's talk about the history of the Americanization, of Americana. Let's talk about white supremacy in schools. Let's talk about institutional sexism, racism, and ableism. Instead of saying factory model as a catch-all term, let's instead use more specific language to describe what it is that we're talking about. And when we do bad history, when we say schools are based on factories or schools are about training factories, what we end up doing is focusing on a few high-profile educators and missing the millions of women and men who shaped American schools in ways big and small. That's my claim. Let's stop using, factory model schools. Let's instead talk about the complicated history.
I would agree with that. This is what I'm going to say, and I'm going to stick with this, which is, and people can double check it if they want. Especially in history, people should be very precise and careful about the way that they look at these things and the lens that they put on them. There is no way, in my mind, that you can read the history of the General Education Board and the way that they use their money and their industrial influence to shape what has become the American high school, for one, but American education just in general, without making note of what their contribution is to what we have today. There's no way of getting around. Like, we can talk about the millions of men and women that did great things in whatever context that we want, but there's no way that I can look at the history of the General Education Board, the philanthropist of the time, what they did with politicians and what they did with the laws of the time, how they helped shape, for good and for ill. I'm not going to say that was all bad, for good and for ill, the way that they created these things, and how all of those things came out of a very specific way of seeing the world.
Sure.
Like compartmentalizing, whatever. Yes. And I'm not going to, I'm always going to live on, there was an explosion of different thought in the 70s, for instance, that we should pay attention to, that was really challenging what we're calling the factory model of schooling right now. Schooling in the 1960s and the 1950s, I don't know if people have nostalgia about what it looked like. I don't know if that was a massive social control project that was meant to create good little white girls and boys and good little, Negro children and whatnot in ways in which we would never, ever today think were acceptable. Right.
Yeah, and that model of creating good little white boys and girls, good little Americans, started in the 1810s. So yes, there were different groups that gave money, philanthropists and titans of industry, but in many cases, they were responding to what was already happening. So the modern American high school emerged from a desire to give kids a broad liberal arts education. If you want to solve the problem of giving kids exposure to Latin, Greek, physics, English, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's your goal. You decide this is what it means to be well educated. You have to break things down into smaller parts. Yes, that is American thinking. But the idea wasn't that it was to disrespect the children, it was to give them as broad an education as possible. So many times we will see something and we will supplant cause and effect. Take, for example, the report Committee of 10. Many people, including in the documentary Most Likely to Succeed, claim that the Committee of 10 shaped American education. Instead, the Committee of 10, the 1894 report, was summarizing what they saw happening and their recommendations for moving forward. So the group that you talked about, we have to sit thoughtfully with, were they supporting what was already happening, or were they proposing something new?
I don't know what that question does for me. Like, listen, let me keep going back to this General Education Board. And I want people to look this up and don't just take my word for it. General Education Board started in 1902 by philanthropists, Frederick Gates and the Rockefellers, and some of the most important philanthropists of the time. That was a shadow government board of public education that had ideas, good and bad. Some of their ideas were to create a system of free education that wasn't racist, like that did allow Black people specifically to partake in public education. But they ran into all kinds of problems with locals, racist locals, the local control. So things that they would try to do for local Negroes actually would get defeated by the locals, including the teachers and including the men, the women, the white women, the parents, and everybody. So this group cannot be washed away like the General Education Board for why these people were marginal, because now where is this? It was in 1903 that General Education Board was incorporated by an act of Congress and became part of the system, right? So their influence was not marginal. The way that they were seeing the world, the way they were seeing school, how it would happen after sixth grade, for instance, the way that it would be funded, who would be able to participate, how they would participate, and what the reasoning was for them doing it. It was very important why they thought we should have this mass system of public schools. Part of it was to reduce ignorance. Part of it was to reduce ignorance, but part of it was out of their class concern.
Well, sure, but we were already developing a mass system of public education. There's a great book called
We were already developing it. I just told you that an act of Congress gave these group of people a different standing than everybody else.
But Congress can do whatever it wants. It can't impact education at the state level. In other words, Congress can't force states to do something related to education, with the exception of Title I funds. So the reason NCLB was unique in education history is because of the levers it used to bring about statewide testing. So NCLB was truly something different in public education because it marked a level of 50 state, 6 territory, congressional input into schools in a way that had never really happened before on that scale. So things that
what about Lyndon Johnson stuff around the... And I know we're veering a little off of the factory model, but I'm just going to challenge that point. I think Congress can do things that actually make a big difference.
The thing that you're describing, they can, but not in the way that impacts classroom pedagogy. So NCLB shifted how we think about teaching math and reading because of the introduction of 3 through 8 tests. The drivers that you're talking about there, that board, they didn't have that level of they had no levers to control. So Congress could say, yeah, you guys can do these things, but they couldn't make Alabama do things related to compulsory education. They couldn't, Alabama.
That's where I will challenge you on the history, and we can't solve it here in the time that we have left. I will encourage people to go and read about the General Education Board and their history and their massive influence and the massive amount of money that they put into, like by today's standards, it would be a lot of money, but the amount of yesterday's standards, of which the money that they put in to encourage government to do things that they wanted them to do.
They encourage all they want.
And they encouraged it to the point where it had an outcome. Like it actually, they encouraged in a way to where Alabama did do some things differently than it had done before because they were dirt poor and they wanted the money.
Yeah. So the tension that I'm going to offer to anyone who wants to follow up on those things is we have to hold in our minds the difference between intention and impact, that they may have tried to do these things, but yet they couldn't get Mississippi to create a system, a desegregated system before Brown v. Board. That a lot of times things were happening in public education because people who worked in schools said, hey, this would be a good solution to our problem. Someone on the outside said, that looks like a good solution. I want to support that solution. So the idea came from the classroom. Outsiders saw it, said, let's spread that. And in terms of kind of understanding the history, I'd also like to share that I'm on Ask Historians on Reddit. I'm a moderator of the subreddit, and I also answer questions under Ask Ed History. So my flair is Ed History 101. And so we frequently get people who ask questions.
What did you just call that? A flare?
Yeah.
I have never heard this. Okay, all right. You're teaching me something today.
My name is Ed History 101, but my flair is education history. And we always are asking questions about education history. And the nice thing about Ask Historians on Reddit is you don't have to take my word for it. I have to provide sources. I have to. So if you come into Ask Historians, as people have asked in the past, are schools based on factories? I will give you the history as to know why they're not. If you ask, what is a factory model? What's the origin of the factory model? I can give you the history of that phrase. So if you'd like to carry on this conversation, I saw some people asking about book recommendations. Feel free to drop me a line on Twitter. I will always make book recommendations. And when we talk about the history of education, the history of Indigenous Americans is its own heartbreaking and important to understand history. And so I'm happy to make recommendations on understanding the history of Indigenous education, pre and post contact, if that's something someone is interested in.
So I did put your flair, which I've learned a new some new terminology today. Apparently I don't spend enough time on Reddit, even though I always fall down a rabbit hole when I do. So I put that in the comments here, and I would encourage people to have these conversations. Jen, I actually encourage us to, keep talking across lines of difference and, across lines of understanding the world differently. I definitely think it takes place differently when we talk directly to each other than like on Twitter, for instance, to go back and forth on Twitter. I do think what's really interesting to me about this conversation is where the white feminist lens bumps up against my understanding of the world based upon a racial lens, a lens of understanding the story of white supremacy in the United States, and to understand the white woman's part of that. Like you're offering a book right there. I would actually encourage people to read a book called The Mothers of Massive Resistance.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Which is about the role that white women played, and also to read the book on civil rights. Civil rights is a history of teachers unions in the United States. It's probably the most textured I've ever seen on the issue, because I didn't know a ton of the stuff about the fight, for instance, between in unions, early unions, the fights between the ones that were more on the communist side of things and the ones that were more on the professional guild side, like the professional guild side. I didn't know about the tensions between the NEA and the AFT, which I think would be important for people to know.
And there's also Blackboard unions, which is another good one. And that has a whole chapter on how dirty teachers did Jewish teachers during the Red Scare. I mean, the whole Red Scare
thing and the civil rights thing prior to Al Shanker and whatnot, I don't think people know that there was a war. It was a war. Yeah, it was a real war. Like people actually, and they thought that the entire teaching profession was on the hook for whoever won that war. Yeah. And what I will posit that you probably won't is that if people investigate that history, they'll figure out that the wrong side won that war in teacher unionism, and that Al Shanker started on one side of it and became a neoconservative after he ascended to become the father of modern teacher unionism. He became a Reaganite in some ways. Not in all ways, but in some ways, very much a neocon, and it's a weird flavor of what you expect to find with unions. Like, how can you be a neocon and a social democrat, unionist? You can. So, anyways,
despite that, teacher unions are still worth fighting for. And as I said, Corey, we should cross paths sometime.
I think teachers unions are, and this is, you will have to come back and do another show on this. I think teachers unions are still the mothers of massive resistance. They are still a white woman's organization that actually is so invested in their battle against the white male establishment that we become their casualties. Things that we want and need, oftentimes they are against, because they're not fighting against us. They're fighting for control over the enterprise with white men, not us. And that the only time they want to listen to us is when they can use us to advance their own agenda, and they will put the rest of us down. So so I think they're part of the problem right now, and they always have been. I think had the right side of the union won back in the late 50s and early 1960s, we would have a totally different school system. And I think we should come back and we should do this show, because I'm sure, yeah, I think you will have a lot to say about that. So let's come back to that. So again, Jenn, thank you for being willing to have these conversations across lines of difference. I don't know where we landed with the factory model.
Don't use the phrase. Don't use the phrase.
Yeah, well, I'm not married to it in a way, but I do like the suggestion that you gave about it, which is to, even if you don't use the phrase, like, talk about the meaning of what you're meaning when you say the phrase, right? And what I'm meaning is like the systematization, the depersonalization, the processing of people as if they're a commodity and a product, the weighing of the pig in some ways that feel like really inhumane, and the compartmentalization, which feels very Western and not the way that the world works. Things are integrated. They're not compartmentalized hour by hour and unit by unit and seat time by seat time and that sort of stuff. To me, I get that makes it efficient to put mass groups of people through, but I'm not a mass group of people. I'm a person, like I'm an individual person, which is why there's some appeal for small schools. That's why there's some appeal for the Montessori method of teaching, where not everybody in the classroom has to be the same age and the same, get the same. We're not all the same. So anyways, for anybody listening and watching, I did drop Jenn's lens flare in so that you can find her, not her lens flare, her Reddit flare, and so that you can find her on Twitter. She's at Jenn Binnis, which is JENN, two N's, and BINIS. I put two N's in it sometimes in the last name. Don't do that. You won't find her. So, and she'll be sure to help you with book recommendations and things you can read. So thank you, Jenn. I appreciate you.
Have a good one.